Well, hello, Facebookers. Steve Barrett again from PRWeek. We're about to record our weekly podcast, and delighted to have Frank Washkuch here, our news editor, regular correspondent, and Mark Stouse from Proof. Hello, Mark.
Hey there, how are you?
I'm very well. Great to have you on board. So we've got a packed show, and we're going to go ahead and start recording soon. If you've got any comments or things you wanted to add or questions, please append them to this. Otherwise, hope you enjoy it, and keep checking back in for the weekly podcast, same time every week on a Thursday. So off we go. Hello and welcome to the PRWeek, PRWeek's regular weekly roundup of everything that matters in the world of PR and communications. My name's Steve Barrett. I'm the editor-in-chief of PRWeek. I'm going to guide you gently through the next 20-25 minutes as we discuss the big issues of the week. Not much going on, is there? Sort of, an inauguration maybe, or a few other things. And a lot of the people in our sector are at Davos, so we're going to talk about that. And Edelman released their trust barometer. We'll talk about that a little bit. And a couple of other big news stories in the company of Frank Washkuch, who's our news editor. How are you doing, Frank?
Doing well. Good to be here.
It's good to have you here, as always. Are you excited about the inauguration?
I'm really excited about the AFC Championship this weekend.
And there's no teams of note playing in that, are there?
No, only the Steelers. And
the Scranton Steelers.
If only. Hopefully they can pull it out and go to the big game. Yeah. Oh, the inauguration. Yeah, that's tomorrow.
Yeah.
It will. It should be really interesting, if nothing else. Like we were talking about before, the speech seems to be under tighter wraps than usual, just in terms of broad themes that leak out beforehand.
Well, they've written 130 characters. I've just got the last 14 to add.
And it might be delivered earlier than usual.
Yeah. And Mark Stouse is with us from Proof. Mark, welcome. Great.
Great to be here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We know you more from the sort of client side, but you've got this exciting new venture, which we're going to find out a bit more of. So tell us about that. Proof sounds interesting. What was it that made you? Tell us a little bit about it, and also tell us what made you jump from the client side at some major corporations to do this.
So beginning about in 2005 or so, I'm still at HP. I'm one of the 4 global leads there. Like everyone in your audience has experienced, probably, our budgets were under pressure. We were being asked to justify what it was that we were doing, and we couldn't. Right? We were absolutely, totally naked. And I started saying, essentially, that's not acceptable anymore. Right? I want to at least be able to defend what's going on, and so, we started a saga. Right? And I think that 10 years later, we're at a place that we never dreamed that we would ever get to. But over the ensuing decade, right, between when we started and now, we just kept on walking up Maslow's hierarchy, right? We kept on collaborating with all kinds of Fortune 1000 leaders to say, hey, if we were going to build something, it's really important that it works for you. Right? It's got to scratch your itch for proof, right? Proof of impact, proof of business value. What would that look like to you? What would you like to see? And so we essentially, before this word was really in common currency, right? We crowdsourced the perspective on what this tool should look like. By 2010, I went to Honeywell largely on the strength of the system that we had created to that point. It had tremendous impact at Honeywell. Even when I left, they licensed the rights to continued use. It began getting industry recognition and awards and all this kind of stuff, right? Which by 2014 started to bring investors out of the woodwork. And the net of the whole thing, right, is that we have been measuring to varying degrees, right, what we do for a really long time, and it has not made any difference. Not because the measurement is not important, it's crucial. Having the data, the performance data on what you're doing, and other performance data like CRM data for sales and things like that, is what makes it all happen. But if you're not putting it all into context and actually demonstrating cause and effect, it's meaningless.
So what is that secret sauce then that everyone's been trying to crack this problem, generations.
Yeah.
What's the secret sauce that has enabled you to come out with something that is going to demonstrate value better than any other measurement systems in the past?
Yeah, no, I think a lot of it has to, we kind of, not being a data scientist myself, right, and being a CMO or a CCO, I had to be ruthlessly pragmatic. And so I did not want to reinvent the wheel. I went out there with people who were a lot more expert than I, years ago, and said, okay, what are how do data scientists deal with this, right? Well, the most important thing is you have to be able to compute the time lag between the action that you take, let's call it the cause, right, and the effect that you're desiring to have. If you can't do that, right, you have nothing, literally, right? You can stare at the two lines on the graph until you're blue in the face and you're not going to get anything. So you have to do that. Then you have to correlate, right? And all these things are known, right? So we did that. The last thing is that you use them to compute as opposed to model attribution, right? So if you're doing 10 things to promote awareness and you have the data on each one of those things that you're doing, the performance data on those 10 things, and you have the data on awareness, you put it into a tool like Proof. It computes on a time lag basis the impact that each one is having, the contribution that each one is having to awareness, and then basically you get a stack rank. And if the top 3 are generating 95% of your lift and the bottom 5 are meaningless, then guess what? You don't have to spend that money anymore. You can take that time, money, and effort and move it over here to something of greater value. Right?
Yeah, one of the challenges, if you look at the advertising industry, they've always had a Nielsen, a system that the industry's bought into.
Right.
And whether it's accurate or not, that's a whole different debate.
Absolutely.
But for better or worse, the industry bought into it. That's how pricing was measured. That's how the effectiveness of an ad was measured, and that's really how the bedrock of the industry. Now they've got their own challenges with digital and
Lots.
people watching on catch up and not really watching live or just phasing out ads. But it was the default. It is the default. How important is it for PR to have that sort of? I guess you'd love to become the default measurement system, but.
Well, I think for Proof, we run across the whole thing, all of Peso, right? So we do stuff on advertising as much as we do it on PR or social or anything else, right? And we also bring in sales data. We bring in macroeconomic data, reputational data, anything from the outside that could be a headwind or a tailwind, right? And we use that when we compute. So it is one of the key things that I would say that we have found is that marketing and communications teams have a much better, exponentially better business value story than they ever dreamed, and certainly that their business leaders ever thought, right? And to the extent that that is true for paid and owned, earned and shared have a dramatic story to tell. And I'm not talking about based on just the low cost of PR relative to anything else. I'm talking about the ability to move the needles that matter in the customer base, particularly in businesses where trust and confidence are really big aspects of the buy decision, particularly in the mid and the late stage. So if you're trying to accelerate deal velocity and you're trying to really expand the deals that you close, independent channels are where your customers are going to go for that kind of input, because that's what addresses their risk.
I feel like you have your work cut out for you a bit when it comes to all of the new strategies that marketers are embracing, whether it's influencer marketing or the various types of social that have come up. How many of those have you had to build in since you guys launched Proof?
Well, it even goes back before I launched Proof, right? At Honeywell and at BMC, we were making use of a lot of that, right? There's some very, very interesting takeaways, right? Sponsored content, what we used to call advertorial, things like that, actually in high cost, high risk buy decisions are net dilutive on trust and confidence, right? And they're also net dilutive on independent media, right? Because people are starting to say, well, this is contaminating the whole ecosystem. One of the things that we can absolutely say, again, based on the calculations, is that in B2B, the traditional marketing mix is kind of skewed about 70% towards paid and owned, and PR and all that stuff gets kind of the leavings. It's actually should be inverted, right? Because again, the average customer comes in, they're probably going to become aware of something new through paid, right? It's the most efficient and effective way to generate that. They're going to go to your website, they're going to learn all you have to say about it and decide whether you're credible at some level. But then after that, they never go back really to those channels because their number one issue is decision risk. So it comes down to your point, does a particular thing that marketing or communications is doing, does that work psychographically for the customer's need, right? If it does, then it's effective. If it doesn't, it's not.
All right, last question, because we've already had 10 minutes of the proof cell, but
Sure.
It's fascinating to hear, and everyone's been talking about this for a long time. You feel then that you have cracked the code for providing that evidence that PR pros have long thought that more should be invested into PR because it's more effective.
Well, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you
and
just
not just for PR, for the whole mix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've just got another $2 million invested yesterday?
Yes, yesterday. Yeah.
From which investors?
Actually, a bunch of different agencies and other private investors, family offices, people like that, right? It was really important to us to actually seek investment from the people who would be using the tool.
Yeah. Great. Well,
Yeah.
listen, everyone's been talking about cracking this code. We wish you well with it, and
Thank
we
you
look
very
forward
much.
to tracking the progress.
You bet.
Frank, let's get into the weekly
Sure.
news. That we mentioned the inauguration. What are your thoughts on that from a communications point of view?
Well, I think it's
this
going
is going to be the presage to a new world, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think it's going to be something that a lot of people can't take their eyes off of tomorrow, whether they love Trump or hate Trump or someplace in the middle. And that, the early word is it's going to be a short speech. Just how short, remains to be seen, and whether it's, contentious or whether it's more of a peacemaker speech, I think remains to be seen as well. I would bet on the latter, considering that when he did his acceptance speech on the night of the election, the morning after actually, it was a very much, it was a speech that really soothed the markets. And I think there's a good chance he might go in that direction as well. But of course with Trump, I mean, the one thing that he has done over and over again since he started running for president is prove people like me wrong on pretty much everything. So, and a lot of us. So I think there are a lot of question marks about what he's going to say and how he's going to say it tomorrow. And also, the nonverbal clues that come around an inauguration too, what's going to be the symbolism and things like that. So I think a lot of people are going to be watching it a lot more closely than they were 4 years ago.
Yeah, it's a second term inauguration is different to a first term. And Mark, a lot of CEOs and C-suite folks would have come back after the holidays or even before then saying to their comms teams, look, we need to be prepared here. If we get caught up in the Trump Twitter crosshairs, whether
Absolutely.
he thinks it's being positive or negative, we all know how some of these stories play out. We covered one last week with LL Bean, where Trump's giving a positive tweet, but it's not coming over positively
Right.
to protest groups, and they handle it pretty well, I
Right.
think. Actually, from your experience as a senior communicator, how different is this world going to be? Is this fresh territory, or are we really? Is it the same principles of corporate reputation that you've got to be keeping front of mind?
I think that when the rest of the world, or in this case, the Oval Office, is moving constantly, having a North Star is really important, right? And so staying clear about who you are, what you believe in, what your plan is, why you care about your audiences and your employees, things like that are crucial. I do think that if you have not given a lot of attention to those kinds of things to this point, your likelihood of being caught out and really have a problem goes up exponentially, right? Because you don't have that North Star. Also, if you've said one thing for a long time and acted in another way, that leaves you're always vulnerable But with a situation like this, depending on the topic, you could be a lot more vulnerable.
So we'll find out inauthentic or untransparent enterprises.
Yeah, I think so.
It's just so hard to predict.
It is very hard.
Because there's no pattern of behavior that leads you to say that on any given day Trump is going to focus on any given thing.
That's right. I do think one thing about the inauguration that's really important to say is that regardless of which side you're on, the inauguration is actually a celebration of the peaceful transfer of executive power, more than it is any individual, right? And all you have to do is look in other countries around the world that don't have that tradition to know how important it is. So while I won't be there, right, and I certainly have my own concerns about that situation, I'll be celebrating the inauguration on that basis.
This is a sort of symbol of democracy.
Absolutely.
What about talking about proving the value of a certain type of communications? How would you assess Trump's communications? Because he spent very little money, compared to Hillary Clinton, but his communication was clearly much more effective. He was using social, he was using earned media, he was letting the stories get out there without paying for a lot of advertising. Is that just a one-off, or has he changed the game plans for
I think it remains to be seen how much it actually changes the game, but I think it is changing the game without a doubt, right? The ability to go direct, the fact that he knew his audience well enough and then was able to use the tools that reached them directly and that appealed to where they already were was powerful. I think, again, and I'm not the first one to talk about this by a long shot, the fact that we can no longer count on the idea that one stranger is going to tell another stranger what they really think. So polling is now kind of up in the air, right? In fact, I think it was the USC poll that was consistently calling it right? But they were kind of an outlier. They were kind of hanging out there, right? So, but I will also say, regardless of what the propaganda is, right? I think he was just as surprised as anyone, right? Yeah. I mean, otherwise, why would you say, well, I think it's going to be rigged, right? So I think that the whole thing, he's riding the wave, but the wave, just like the ocean in general, can change in a heartbeat and destroy.
No grand strategy.
No.
Now, when somebody who's been on the inside of corporations, how do you think he's going to use Twitter once he takes office?
Well, it certainly looks like right now that he's going to continue to use it, perhaps as he has. He's indicated he's going to keep his own handle, right, and, as opposed to using POTUS. I think that the next 4 years will be, what happens big and small will be dictated by black swans, right? Things that we cannot compute in any way. And I think that something could happen that renders his use of Twitter no longer in his best interests, right? And he will see that and stop.
Yeah, people were wearing "Do Just Stop" T-shirts, weren't they, last weekend when he was doing some of his tweeting. And yeah, we'll see how that plays out, but it's fascinating stuff for sure.
He's a better campaigner than he is. I mean, there's a difference between campaigning and governing.
That's right, very much so. Let's talk about Davos. The world's business elite has been gathered in the Swiss ski resort.
You seem to be cynical about Davos this year, isn't it?
Well, it was slightly ironic that all these folks were talking to us about, getting to know diverse points of view and et cetera, from the luxury slopes of the Davos resort. But Frank, talk to us a little bit about that. And of course, that's where Edelman always releases its trust barometer, doesn't it, every year?
Right. Yeah, Davos, I don't want to say under a cloud this year, but in a different bit of circumstances than years past with the populist votes in both the UK and the US this November. So the elites at Davos are, and many of them we should point out, are agency executives from PR firms who are there working with clients or like Edelman on their own behalf. So they're talking a lot about populism this year. Reuters had a story this morning about how many of them are urging their counterparts to focus on local supply chains. And they are talking a lot about focusing on everyday people, for lack of a better term. You mentioned that Edelman releases the Trust Barometer there every year. In fact, they released it on Sunday night. Interesting findings, and I think they don't fit a very specific pattern. You would think in the year where Donald Trump wins an election, trust in all kinds of U.S. institutions would go down. In fact, trust in the media went down, but trust in other institutions like government and business actually went up. So you have a much more complicated, more of a puzzle than you would have had in years past, where it was a unanimous dive or a unanimous rise. So a really interesting study, as it is every year. You get a little bit into the specifics. Government, despite the fact that Congress has such low approval ratings, but the president has high approval ratings, government saw an 8% jump in the amount of people that consider it a trusted source. Business is up 7%. NGOs.
This is globally, yeah?
This is U.S.
Oh, U.S.
This is
okay.
U.S. NGOs are up 1%. Now the media is down again. But interesting that all of those are up in a presidential election.
Yeah, you could say that's coming from a very low base, which it is, but it is interesting, and it's for sure the media's got a lot of challenges and a lot of issues to have on its radar. Mark, you've supported senior executives at Davos before, CEOs, etc. How did you see Davos in the scheme of things, and how important was it as an event to get your messages? You talked about your North Star. How important was it in establishing and maintaining that North Star and promoting it?
You know, I would say that it was a great stage on which to talk to audiences back in the United States or in other parts of the world, right? It was more, in some respects, more impactful to be on stage with CNBC for a few minutes than it was to actually be in the mix, so to speak.
Yeah, in fact, Richard Edelman was on CNBC talking about the Trust Barometer, wasn't he, on Monday morning? Which was interesting.
So I think that, you know, as kind of a person who used to be political and is still kind of a policy wonk in some respects, I mean, you know, you can attend sessions until it was like 3 in the morning or something like that, and so I kind of binge watched Davos when I went there, right? And you saw a lot and heard a lot of fascinating points of view, but it is absolutely within the bubble. Right, no question. Sir Martin totally nailed it, right, on that. Also, like them, and I'm kind of in that same bubble. I realized after the election, I thought that Hillary was going to walk away with it. It showed me my own lack of awareness of a certain segment of society and what they believe and what they really want. That I hold myself personally responsible for. And I think that every single one of the people in Davos, and that, you know, the so-called Davos man and Davos woman, right, needs to have a real heart-to-heart with themselves and, you know, and disabuse themselves, right?
What would your top tip be for a PR pro going to Davos to support their execs?
You are, it is, in terms of competing for attention and airtime, it is among the most competitive environments I've ever worked in. You had better have plan A, B, C, D, and E, because one of the things that your CEO is going to not appreciate is spending all that money, that time, that effort, and walking out of Davos without their trophy clip, whatever that is, right? You need to realize that even though that sounds a little whatever, right, that is, you can't underestimate what that means. If you're looking at it strictly in terms of business, strictly in terms of, you know, reaching an audience or whatever, you will miss a key political aspect. But what I mean is political within the company. If you're seen to bring home the bacon from Davos, your stock will go up. And if you didn't, and it doesn't matter why, right, it will have a very negative outcome.
Good. Okay, good advice there. Frank, let's talk about a couple of stories that broke this week. USA Gymnastics, an organisation under fire. sexual abuse allegations, they brought on Fleischman Hillard to help them out with that crisis.
That's right. They brought on Fleischman Hillard in December, which was when the Gannett newspaper, the Indianapolis Star, published some of their most recent investigations into hundreds of cases of allegations of sexual abuse against gymnastic coaches across the country. And this is a series of reports that they've been doing since just before the Rio Olympics, so since the summer. So it's really like a 6-month, half-year scandal that's just been rolling. They brought on Fleischman recently for crisis support as this goes on, so it'll be interesting to see how they
It was a little bit late in the day in that sort of.
Yes,
story
I would think
line.
so, because I think, as we all know with investigative reports, the companies or the organizations that the story is about tend to have a bit of a heads up that the story's going live. So I'm surprised they didn't hire a firm earlier, yeah.
Yeah,
Mark,
totally agree with that. I think also, with any damaged brand, right, we've seen a lot of them lately. My alma mater, right, Baylor University went through its own situation with its football program, Wells Fargo, I mean, there's, Chipotle, whatever, right, there's lots of them. One of the ways that intersects what proof is all about, right, is that when you start to come out of that, you need to know what damaged you the most on a cause and effect basis. And then if you're the CCO or the CMO, you need to be able to substantiate that what you're doing is helping the business reclaim its business performance. And if you don't have that, once you get outside of the immediate crisis communications kind of zone, where all of us feel very appreciated, right, then you will be forgotten again.
Yeah, that's certainly the area where the marketers tend to sort of disappear into the shadows, don't they? And the heavy lifting is definitely done by the communications department. Would you, from a client point of view, would you have a crisis firm on retainer that you would tap into when you needed it? Because obviously you're not going to be in crisis all the time. I guess there's a certain amount of pre-planning work that you want them to help you with. But the nature of the crisis is that you're going to, get them involved when you need them. But how would you? What's the best
That's
way
exactly what we did with Joel Frank.
Right.
When you're in it, all of a sudden, that is not a good time to try to spin up the agency on all of the cultural issues that impact this, the way the company makes decisions, the history, the this, the that, right? It is so helpful if they already know all that. If that level set has already taken place, and indeed if they've already kind of had an opportunity here and there to live through it a little bit, when all of a sudden you get the alert that privatization is getting ready to happen, or you've got a problem with a product, or some scandal or something like that, it is significantly more impactful if you already have the relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where PR people will always be essential, and will, that is a place where you can shine, and where the CEO and the C-suite definitely appreciate the efforts and the input and the counsel.
Yeah, and I think another very important statement to make about that is that historically, the way comms people in particular, but also marketing people, they don't prioritize those things. It's sort of like measurement. They don't prioritize that either. And those, when they get caught out, whether it's on the crisis side or on the measurement side, it really bites them disproportionately. And so they're so cost conscious, that's why they're trying to do it this way, right? But it's a false economy, right? You'd be much better off going to somebody like Joel Frank and saying, look, right, I need you on retainer. I can pay you $3,000 a month, basically to do nothing except occasionally listen to me and become familiar with my company. And then all of a sudden, if we get in a situation, then the billing is the billing, right? That is, that will be $36,000 a year, very well spent. Ditto on the measurement piece.
Yeah, well, when you look at the amount Wells Fargo lost, the amount Volkswagen
Absolutely.
ended up getting fined, this is absolutely right. It's definitely to be encouraged. Okay, just quickly, Frank, because we're running out of time. Julie Binder.
That's right, our most popular story of the week.
A lot of traffic.
Julie Binder, you might even know her from PRWeek's 40 Under 40 a few years ago. She has joined Compass, which is a really interesting real estate tech startup. She's reporting to CEO Robert Refkin and overseeing a team of 3 staffers as she heads up their communications department there. Before joining Compass, she was VP at Percolate, which is an enterprise marketing fit.